Shalom, family, and welcome back to Covenant Convo with Shaya. Today we're going to be talking about the temple was not a church, restoring covenant order in Yasharal. The first mistake. People have equated the temple with the church. Our people have been trained to think the church building today is basically what the temple was back then. That is completely inaccurate. The temple was not a weekly gathering place, a sermon hall, a fellowship center, a congregational worship space. Nor was it a place where the nation gathered to hear the word. The temple was strictly a sacrificial facility, an altar-centered structure, a restricted space, a blood work location. And it was a judicial covenant site. In modern terms, without modernizing it, it functioned more like a national altar complex, not a church. There are multiple sacrificial sites within Yasharal. Before the kingdom split, and even into portions of the divided kingdom period. Yasharal was spread across a large mass. Daily offerings, vows, thanksgiving offerings, and purifications had to continue. It was not logistically possible for every household, every clan, every region to travel to Yarusalam daily or regularly. So within Yasharal, local sacrificial sites, regional altars, designated high places, bamath, were used for offering sacrifices. This is historically and textually true. B. These sites were sacred, but they were not Yah's house. Those regional sacrificial locations were sacred. They were set apart. They functioned for offerings. And they were part of Yasharal's lived reality. But they were not called Yah's house. Why? Because Yah's house is not defined by sacrifice alone. C. What made Yah's house singular? Only one temple held this status. The temple in Yarusalam. What distinguished it was not convenience or frequency, but covenantal placement. Yah's house was the place where his name was placed. The seat of national covenant authority. The location of judicial priesthood, the center of national atonement, and it was the point of unified identity. So while sacrifices occurred elsewhere, authority did not. That is the key. D. Sacrifice does not equal authority. And this is where people get confused. Sacrifice could occur in multiple locations for practical reasons. Authority was centralized. Local altars handled daily needs, vows, purification, and thanksgiving. Yah's house handled national sin, covenant breaches, priestly governance, appointed times tied to the whole nation, and the centralized priesthood under Aharon's line. So even though blood was poured in many places, judgment, covering, and national standing flowed from one place. Why Scripture still pushes centralization? As Yasharal matured as a nation, Yah repeatedly pushed towards reducing reliance on local altars, consolidating worship authority, and centralizing priesthood function. Not because sacrifice elsewhere was automatically evil, but because fragmented authority always led to drift. That drift is exactly what later happened. High places became corrupted. Practices blended. Authority fractured. And kings failed to remove Bamoth. So Yah's house remained singular even when practices were plural. Why Yahusha's words only apply to one place? This is why Yahusha says, "My Father's house." He says this only in Yarusalam. He never says it at regional altars, at other sacrificial sites, or anywhere else in the land, because only one place carried the name, the covenant center, the national authority. That language cannot be transferred to other sites, even within Yasharal. When we see the text, it says he went to the temple. It was the one temple in Yarusalam that was the Most High's house, where his name was. We don't see him call the synagogue that he entered Yah's house. He calls the temple in Yarusalam Yah's house. The second point. Who could actually go into the temple? Only a very small portion of Yasharal ever functioned inside the temple itself. The people did not freely enter. They did not sit inside, nor did they gather there weekly. Most of Yasharal came to the course when required. They brought offerings when commanded, and then they returned home. The temple was not designed for mass assemblies. Point 3. The priesthood was not generic. Only the sons of Aharon or Aaron were priests. Period. They alone handled sacrifices, approached the altar, entered the holy place, or performed blood work. There were no rotating priesthoods. There were no called pastors stepping into priestly robes. There was no universal access. This was lineage locked, covenant locked, and Yah ordained. Point 4. The Levites or Levites were not all priests. This is another place where church teaching collapses categories. The Levites were a tribe with divisions, not one role. A. Aharon's sons. Aharon's sons were the priests. They did altar work, handled sacrifices, burned incense, and managed blood handling. They did one thing, and it was serious, dangerous work. B. The sons of Masha, or Moses, teachers, shepherds. They were responsible for teaching Torah, instructing the people, guiding community order, and helping judge matters. These are closer to what people think pastors are. But pastors today are not their replacement. Teaching did not require temple access. C. Mararim or Morari. They were the keepers, transport, and maintenance officials of the temple. They handled structural elements, heavy components, care of sacred furnishings, physical maintenance. Not teaching, not preaching, not sacrifices, not altar work. This is nothing like modern church staff. D. Gashanim or Gershon. They handled structure and logistics. The coverings, framework, movement of sacred spaces. Again, functional, not spiritual leadership. E. Miriamim or Miriam. They were in charge of women's instruction, prophetic worship, song, intercession, purification ministry. This is often erased completely. But they taught women, instructed on purity, order, household law. They led prophetic song, engaged in intercessory ministry. They were the keepers of the knives and vessels, garments, and other linen, making sure they were clean. And they ensured ritual readiness. This did not happen in the temple. Point 5. Purification had to be a dedicated ministry. Keeping vessels clean, bowls, basins, implements used in blood and offerings. Anything defiled rendered unusable until purified. Maintaining garments and linen, priestly garments, altar cloths, curtains, coverings, and fabric items. Ensuring ritual readiness. Nothing unclean approaching altar service. Nothing compromised. Entering restricted space. This was not cleaning in modern sense. This was covenant sanitation, guarding the boundary between clean and unclean, set apart and common, acceptable and rejected. And this was done by the descendants of Miriam, or the Mariamim people, the Luim family. A. Why this could not be done by priests themselves? The priests handled blood, handled offerings, performed altar work. They entered restricted spaces. They could not also be responsible for laundering, vessel restoration, purification logistics. Why? Because of cross-contamination. Cross-contamination was dangerous. Roles had to remain distinct. Accountability had to be traceable. Purity had to be verified independently. So the Mariamim, or the Mariamim, functioning as a purification ministry, preserves safety, order, traceability, and covenant integrity. B. Why Yasharal needs to understand this today? Modern religious thinking collapses everything into the pastor does it all, or assigns anybody, whoever they are. Ancient covenant structure says no. Every function has a house, a lineage, and a boundary. Teaching the Mariamim role helps Yasharal understand why covenant systems were precise, why Yah demanded order, why purity was not symbolic, it was operational, why negligence in logistics could bring judgment. This also helps to understand why defilement matters so much in Jeremiah and in Kanahim, or Lamentations. When purification collapses, judgment follows. When vessels are defiled, worship becomes unacceptable. So when garments are unclean, access is revoked. Point 6. So where did Yasharal actually gather, since we know they didn't gather in the temple? And this is a critical correction that needs to be made. A. Solemn assemblies were not held in the temple. They were held at city gates, in open courts, in designated gathering spaces, in the land, among the people. Assemblies were national, communal, instructional, judicial, and covenantal. The temple could not hold the nation, and it was never meant to. B. Tents were raised at gatherings. Yasharal did not suddenly abandon wilderness logistics once settled in the land. During feasts, appointed times, jubilees, and national or solemn assemblies, temporary dwellings and coverings would absolutely have been raised when weather required it. Gatherings lasted multiple days, or large numbers of people traveled from afar. This is consistent with wilderness precedent, feast patterns, especially booths and dwelling reminders, large-scale national convocations. These were functional structures, not temples, not sanctuaries, and not priestly spaces. C. Why were they called solemn assemblies? The word solemn is often misunderstood. It does not mean quiet. It does not mean sad. It is not church-like or ceremonial for the sake of ceremony. It means restricted, weighty, covenantal. A solemn assembly was a national address, a covenant reckoning, a legal and moral summons, a king speaking to his people. D. Who could attend and who could not? Solemn assemblies were for covenant people only. They were not open forums. They were not evangelistic gatherings, nor were they inclusive assemblies. They were internal, familial, national, and legal. Only those under the covenant could stand and hear the address. E. Strangers and sojourners. Strangers and sojourners could live among Yasharal. They could trade, they could do labor, and they could benefit from laws of mercy. But they were not permitted into covenant assemblies, national reckonings, or solemn convocations. Why? Because they were not accountable to the covenant in the same way as Yasharal. They were not bound to national judgment. And they were not under oath to Yah as a nation. It is similar to the wilderness camp. In the wilderness, there were zones and boundaries. There were levels of access. There were restrictions based on covenant status. Solemn assemblies follow that same logic. F. Now, why is your sister Shaya instructed to clarify this? Modern religious thinking assumes if Yah is speaking, everyone should be allowed to listen. That is not how covenant works. Covenant speech is family business, national discipline, internal correction. You don't discipline your household in front of outsiders. Solemn assemblies were Yah saying, Yasharal, this is between you and I. G. Why this is especially important for future covenant Convo with Shaya videos. This distinction will help Yasharal understand why Yah could speak harshly without apology. Why assemblies were closed, not open. Why covenant identity mattered more than proximity. And why modern open worship models don't map backward. And it prevents people from projecting church models, modern inclusivity doctrines, missionary frameworks onto an ancient covenant structure that never functioned that way. Point 7. Why does this distinction matter spiritually? Because when people think the temple was where worship happened, they misunderstand everything. Worship was obedience, covenant faithfulness, justice, righteousness, and separation. Sacrifice was only one part, and it required precision because it dealt with blood and atonement. The temple was not about feelings, music services, or motivational teaching. It was about maintaining covenant order, addressing sin legally, and preserving national standing before Yah. Point 8. Why modern churches confuse people? Modern churches mix priesthood, teaching, leadership, and sacrifice language. They assign priestly authority where there is none. They create buildings that imitate temple symbolism. They claim access and authority that Yah never gave. This leads people to believe gathering equals sacrifice. Preacher equals priest. Building equals holy. Money equals offering. None of this is covenantally accurate. Point 9. Why this will matter for Covenant Convo with Shayya's future videos. This distinction will help Yasharal understand why Yah judged the temple. It will help them see why religious performance didn't stop captivity. It will clarify why Yah left the temple, but still spoke to the people. And it will prepare them to understand why repentance was national, not ritual. It also protects the Jeremiah and Lamentations assignment from being misread as Yah was mad they didn't go to church enough. No. Yah was prosecuting covenant betrayal, not attendance. Point 10. How this connects back to Jeremiah and Kanahim or Lamentations 5. When Yah destroys the temple, sacrifice stops. Altar work ends. Priestly function collapses. But the people are still accountable. Why? Because covenant was not confined to the temple. Lamentations is the cry of a people who lost altar access. They lost leadership and they lost land. Not because they missed church, because they broke covenant. Okay. Now let's deal with this term synagogue. The synagogue, origin, purpose, and why it is not Abraham covenant design. This part of the teaching exists to restore clarity because many people today assume the synagogue is ancient, covenant designed, Mosaic, or the natural precursor to the church. None of those assumptions are correct. Number one, The synagogue is not found in the Torah, the prophets, or the writings as a covenant institution. You do not see the word synagogue in the Abarim scriptures as an Abarim structure. In the Tanakh, covenant life includes the dwelling in the wilderness, the temple, sacrifice and altar work only, assemblies of the people, elders at the gates, judges, prophets, Levitical instruction. What you do not see, a synagogue system, weekly instructional buildings, rabbinical lecture halls, congregational sermon culture, permanent lay-led teacher centers. That absence matters. If synagogues were covenant designed, they would have been commanded, regulated, assigned lineage, given purity laws, and clearly defined in Torah. But they were not. Point 2. When did synagogues actually arise? Synagogues arise in captivity, not in covenant autonomy. The origin point, the Babylonian captivity after 586 BCE. This is the critical turning point. Before Babylon, temples stand, or the temple stands. Sacrifice functions. National authority exists. Assemblies are governed internally. And covenant order is intact, even if violated. After Babylon, the temple is destroyed. Sacrifice impossible. Priesthood disrupted. People scattered. Diaspora begins. National sovereignty is lost. This creates a problem. How do you preserve identity, instruction, and cohesion without a temple, without sacrifice, and without national authority? The answer was adaptation, not command. Point 3. What the synagogue actually is. A synagogue is a meeting hall, a teaching space, a reading forum, a community administration center. It is text-centered, not altar-centered. It is instructional, not sacrificial. It is permitted, not commanded. Functionally, it mirrors Babylonian civic halls, Persian administrative spaces, Greek lecture environments, Roman community meeting structures. This is why synagogues feel structurally foreign, even when Abarim texts are read inside them. They are captivity infrastructure, not covenant design. Point 4. Why did foreign powers allow synagogues? Foreign rulers do not rule by chaos. They rule by controlled familiarity. They consistently strip native authority, dismantle indigenous systems, and they replace them with structures familiar to themselves. They allow limited cultural expression that does not threaten their power. Synagogues were allowed because they did not involve sacrifice. They did not enforce covenant law. They did not restore national sovereignty, nor did they challenge imperial rule. Instruction is safe. Sacrifice and covenant enforcement are not. The Greek word synagogue and the translation confusion. This is where people get misled. The word synagogue is Greek, not arboreum. It simply means a gathering or an assembly. In the Greek Septuagint, LXX, translators used synagogue to translate older arboreum words that meant the people gathered, not a building. The key arboreum word, kahal, the meaning is assembly, gathered people, congregation. There are 3 pictographs that spell kahal. You have the qaf, you have the ha, and you have the lamad. The qaf symbolizing horizon, change, transition. That is exactly why it fits assembly. Because a covenant assembly is not random gathering. It's a transition event. People move from scattered to gathered, from private to public accountability, from disorder to ordered instruction, from business as usual to now Yah speaks, now judgment is read, now direction is given. So Kaf is the turning point, summoned to a moment marker. Ha. Breath, reveal, behold symbol. This is the made manifest, spoken, revealed art. What is gathered to hear, to receive a word, charge, correction, or instruction. Lamad, authority, staff, instruction symbol. This seals the function. The gathering is for governance. Instruction from authority. Direction and correction. It does not mean synagogue building, institutional hall, or permanent structure. Point 6. The clear example we can point to is Psalms 74 and 8. In Abarim context, this verse speaks of appointed assemblies, gathering places, communal meeting points of the people. There were no synagogue buildings in David's time. Yet in the Greek Septuagint, translators used synagogue, which later English readers misread as they burned all the synagogues of Alua in the land. This is a retrojection, a later Greek term projected backward onto an earlier covenant context where the institution did not exist. So when people say synagogues are in the Old Testament, they are confusing Greek translation language with Abraham covenant reality. Poisson, the Second Temple period during Yahusha's time. By Yahusha's time, Yasharal is under Roman occupation. The temple still stands, but it's politicized. Priesthood is compromised. Synagogues are widespread and normalized. This does not mean synagogues are covenant designed. It means captivity structures have become familiar. Point 8. The critical distinction Yahusha makes. When Yahusha enters the temple, he drives people out, overturns tables, declares judgment, says explicitly, "You had made my father's house a den of thieves." That language is exclusive to the temple. The temple in Yarusalam. Why? Because the temple belongs to Yah. It is altar-centered, covenant restricted, and yet it had been defiled. When Yahusha enters a synagogue, he teaches, he reads, he explains, he reasons. There is no cleansing. There is no judgment declaration. There is no claim of ownership. Two places, two functions, two different responses. His presence there does not equal his endorsement. Yahusha met his people where they were under occupation, not where they were designed to be. Now let's look at Luke 2:46. And it came to pass that after 3 days they found him in the temple, sitting in the midst of the doctors, both hearing them and asking them questions. The Greek word used for temple in Luke 2:46 is the Greek word hieron. Abraham defines hieron as a sacred precinct, complex, or consecrated zone, not the inner dwelling of a deity. In Abraham terms, hieron, Hieron, refers to a designated sacred area, courts, porticos, chambers, teaching spaces, public access, religious zone, an area where instruction, discussion, and legal debate occurred. It is not the house of Yah, or does not mean the house where Yah dwells. It is not Naos. This distinction is critical because Naos means inner dwelling, divine residence, restricted access. Yahusha nor doctors would have been there. Insensitivity to the sacredness of the house of Yah happens in stages. In the younger years of HaMashiach, it is still somewhat a sacred space. It is decades later when we see Yahusha going to the temple in Yarusalam and it is totally defiled. All right, let's look at 3 separate spaces. A, Yah's house, the dwelling, seat of his presence. An Abraham concept, a fixed dwelling where the authority of the deity is localized. Key Abraham characteristics are singular, restricted, not conversational, not instructional, nor is it communal. It is restricted, access controlled by purity, lineage, and appointment. The Abraham rule here, teaching, debate, or inquiry does not occur at this site. If Luke 2:46 were describing this, the passage would be impossible. B. The consecrated complex, sacred domain. This is often mistranslated as the temple in English. Abraham concept is a sanctified territory set apart for sacred use, containing multiple functions. These functions include courts, chambers, porticos, treasury adjacent areas, teaching halls, legal discussion spaces. The Abraham rule, this space is sacred, but not the dwelling. Instruction is permitted here. Discussion is permitted here. Questioning authorities is permitted here. Public access is tiered but permitted. This is not Yah's house, but it belongs to the sacred order. C. The assembly, instructional house. Functionally, what later gets called synagogue. The Abraham concept is a gathered instructional space authorized for teaching, reading, and judgment. Abraham key traits. It can exist inside a sacred complex. It can exist outside of a sacred complex. Defined by function, not architectured, centered on hearing, asking, interpreting, or discerning. The Abraham rule here, this is where doctors, elders, and teachers operate. So what Abraham concept is Luke 2:46 using? Luke 2:46 places Yahusha in a consecrated instructional assembly, operating within a sacred domain, not within the dwelling of Yah. Or stated another way, the translators collapsed three Abraham categories into one English word: temple. That's the entire problem and what causes confusion. So we've already established one place was Yah's house. Teaching, gatherings never occurred there. Roman occupation already distorted sacred space usage. Daily instruction still had to occur somewhere. So when the text says Yahusha was sitting, listening, questioning, and surrounded by teachers, Abraham automatically excludes Yah's house. Luke 2:46 does not describe Yahusha inside Yah's house. It describes him within a sanctified instructional assembly space, located inside the broader sacred complex, functioning like what we would later label a synagogue. So let me ask you this. If the modern church building is considered the house of Yah, why would you have funerals there? Why would you bring dead bodies there? That would be defilement. It's a sacred space. Dead bodies are not to be there. Why would you have weddings there? It is a sacred space. So the modern church is not the house of Yah, and the synagogue is not the house of Yah. So why does this matter for Yasharal today? If this is not taught clearly, people will project synagogues backward into Torah, treat captivity adaptations as covenant ideals. They will replace one foreign structure with another. And they will continue submitting to systems Yah never designed to govern them. This is the same error people make with churches. Different origin, same displacement of covenant order. All right, family. I pray this message has been a blessing to you and clears things up for you. Thank you again for watching Yasharal. Your sister loves you, and more importantly, the Most High Yah loves you. Shalom.